From the outside, my life looked like a dream. I was a successful businessman, the owner of a multi-million-dollar company that had grown beyond my wildest expectations. But none of this came easy. My journey began working as a waiter alongside Dan, who would later become my business partner. We were two young guys trying to make a living, hustling at a local diner, and dreaming of bigger things. Now, we weren't just colleagues, we were the faces of a thriving business empire. And yet, despite everything we'd built, there was always this quiet distance between us. We were friends, sure, but never close. At home, I had Emily. She was everything a man could hope for in a wife. Stunning, smart, and always perfectly dressed. She knew how to walk into a room and command attention. When I struggled in the early days, she was my biggest supporter, my motivation. Emily was the one who pushed me, telling me that I could do better, that I could grow beyond the limits of my imagination. And I did. I threw myself into my work, building the business, growing our wealth, and ensuring that Emily and I lived a life of comfort and luxury. Emily loved the life we had. She thrived in the glamorous social circles, adored the lavish vacations, and reveled in the luxury that success brought us. I was happy to give her all of that. I worked long hours to keep our lifestyle running smoothly, often leaving early in the morning and coming back late at night, exhausted but fulfilled. I told myself that my hard work was all for us, for her, for our future. Little did I know, while I was building an empire, something else was happening right under my nose. Emily and I had a comfortable routine, and even though my work kept me busy, I never questioned her loyalty. She was my rock, the woman who had been with me through the tough times. I trusted her completely. In the back of my mind, I knew I was absent a lot, too many late nights, too many business trips, but I convinced myself that she understood. After all, she enjoyed the perks of the business as much as I did. Why would she ever jeopardize that? Then came the weekend that changed everything. Dan and I had planned a little getaway with our wives, a chance to relax and unwind from the stress of the business. We rented 2 cabins near a lake, far away from the chaos of the city. It was meant to be a peaceful escape, where we could barbecue, take long walks in the forest, and enjoy each other's company without the pressures of the corporate world looming over us. On the morning of the second day, we all agreed to go for a walk in the woods to take in the fresh air. But Emily wasn't feeling well. She said she had a headache and would stay behind. Dan was still sleeping, so I headed out with his wife for a quick stroll. When we returned, I immediately noticed something was different about Emily. She was sitting on the couch, laughing with Dan, who had apparently woken up while we were gone. They were watching a comedy, she said, trying to lighten her mood. It seemed innocent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emily was in an unusually good mood, almost too cheerful. It was subtle, but the way she looked at Dan, the way she smiled at him, it stirred something in me. I tried to push it aside. After all, what was I thinking? She was my wife, and he was my business partner. We had all been friends for years. Why would I even entertain such a ridiculous thought? But the feeling lingered, like a bad itch that wouldn't go away. I chalked it up to stress. I had been working too hard, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Emily had always been by my side, supporting me through the long nights and stressful days. She wouldn't betray me. Not her. And Dan? We had built a business together, gone through the highs and lows of entrepreneurship. He was ambitious, yes, but he was also someone I trusted with everything: my business, my future. As we packed up to head home at the end of the weekend, I told myself to forget about it, to let it go. But that small seed of doubt had already been planted. The barbecue weekend continued as planned, but something had shifted. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but Emily's energy felt different. I tried to enjoy myself, tried to shake the nagging feeling from earlier, but her laughter with Dan, her sudden lightheartedness, it just didn't sit right with me. That afternoon, we set up the grill outside. The weather was perfect, the kind of sunny day that would usually lift my spirits. I could see Dan in his element, joking around, taking charge of the barbecue. His wife and Emily were inside, preparing side dishes and drinks. It all seemed normal on the surface, but beneath it, I felt like an outsider looking in on my own life. Every time Emily and Dan exchanged a glance or a smile, I found myself questioning it. Was I just overthinking things? As the afternoon wore on, The four of us sat around a picnic table, eating and chatting. Emily was seated across from me, and Dan was next to her. I noticed her body language leaning toward him when he spoke, laughing at all his jokes, even the unfunny ones. It felt like I was watching them share some unspoken connection, one that I wasn't a part of. I caught her glancing at him more often than at me, as if she was drawn to him in ways I hadn't noticed before. The worst part was, I couldn't confront her. How could I, when I didn't even know if there was anything to confront? I didn't want to come off as paranoid or insecure, especially in front of Dan and his wife. So I played along, smiling and pretending everything was fine, even though my insides were churning. It was infuriating to sit there, pretending to enjoy the weekend while my mind kept replaying all the subtle moments I had noticed. Later that evening, after everyone had a few drinks, I watched as Dan and Emily sat a little too close to each other on the couch. I excused myself to grab something from the car, taking the opportunity to clear my head. I stood in the dark for a few moments, staring out at the trees surrounding the cabin, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. As I walked back toward the cabin, I could hear them laughing Emily's laughter, soft and easy. It was the kind of laugh she used to reserve for me, the kind that once made me feel like the most important person in the room. I opened the door, stepping inside just in time to see her resting her hand on his arm, a gesture that sent my mind spiraling into darker places. I tried to shake it off again, telling myself I was being ridiculous. She was just being friendly, right? But the doubt was growing stronger. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I lay awake in bed while Emily slept peacefully beside me. I kept replaying the day in my head, the looks, the touches, the smiles. Every little interaction between her and Dan seemed loaded with meaning now. What if there was something going on? What if I had been blind to it all along? The following morning, we packed up and said our goodbyes. Dan and his wife were heading back to the city, and Emily and I were driving separately. I remember watching Dan and Emily share a quick hug before we left. It felt too long, too familiar, and something in me snapped. I was no longer just suspicious, I was certain something was happening behind my back. I didn't have proof yet, but I knew. On the drive home, I couldn't hold back any longer. So, you and Dan seemed pretty close this weekend, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Emily gave me a confused look. What do you mean? I don't know, I shrugged. You just seemed happy around him, that's all. She laughed, the sound grating on my nerves. You're imagining things. We were all just having a good time, that's all. Dan's funny, and it was nice to relax for once. I nodded, but the unease didn't fade. I didn't press further. I couldn't, not without sounding like I was accusing her of something. But deep down, I was already beginning to believe the worst. Once we got home, life returned to normal, or at least it appeared to. I went back to work, throwing myself into meetings, deals, and everything that kept my business running. But I couldn't stop thinking about that weekend. The looks between Emily and Dan, the way she had seemed so at ease around him, it all played on a loop in my mind. Days went by, and I noticed more subtle changes in Emily. She was on her phone more often, laughing at messages she wouldn't share with me. Her absences from home became more frequent, usually explained by errands or last-minute plans with friends. Then there were the flowers. She started bringing home expensive bouquets of roses, something she'd never done before. Where did these come from? I asked one evening, pointing to the newest arrangement sitting on the dining table. Oh, I bought them myself, she said casually. You haven't given me flowers in a while, so I figured I'd treat myself. Something about that answer felt off. Emily loved flowers, but she had never been the type to buy them for herself. I let it go, but it gnawed at me. Then one day, I overheard her on the phone, laughing softly. I couldn't hear who she was talking to, but I knew that laugh, the same one I heard that weekend at the cabin. That laugh was reserved for Dan. It was time to get some answers. I installed a security app on my phone that allowed me to check the camera footage outside our office building, just to see if anything unusual was going on. I wasn't expecting much, but when I saw Emily's car parked outside the office late at night, I was very surprised. She had told me she was out with a friend that night, grabbing dinner and catching up. But there was her car, right under my office window. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I needed more proof, something undeniable, before I could confront her. And so began the most painful investigation of my life. After that weekend, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening behind my back. My mind, once occupied by business strategies and client meetings, was now consumed with suspicion. I kept telling myself I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof, before I could confront Emily. Without it, any accusation would be dismissed as paranoia. But the more I watched her, the more the clues started to pile up. It started small. Emily's mood shifts were subtle but noticeable. She was often on her phone, texting late into the night, and whenever I asked who she was talking to, she'd give me vague answers like, just a friend, or it's nothing important. That wasn't like her. Before, she used to tell me everything, share every little detail of her day. But now, there was a distance, a wall that hadn't been there before. It felt like she was hiding something, and that something was Dan. The more I paid attention, the more I saw it. Emily started dressing up more often, even when she had no plans that I knew of. At first, I brushed it off. She was always fashionable, always put together. But this was different. She wore clothes that she hadn't worn in months, pieces that made her look stunning, effortless but perfect. The same outfits she used to save for special occasions. One evening, after a long day at the office, I came home to find her on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. When she noticed me, she quickly ended the call and offered a casual explanation. "It's just one of the girls," she said. "We're planning a get-together next week." It sounded plausible, but the way she rushed to hang up made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, but the seed of doubt had already grown roots. Something wasn't right, and I needed to know what it was. That's when I decided to check the office security footage. I had installed cameras outside the building for safety reasons, but they could now serve a different purpose. I scrolled through the recordings, and there it was, Emily's car, parked outside the office late at night on several occasions. She had never mentioned stopping by the office during those times, so why was she there? I confronted her about it, asking why she'd been at the office late at night. Her response was quick, almost rehearsed. "Oh, I dropped by to see if you were still working. I thought I'd surprise you, but you weren't there, so I left. It's no big deal." Her explanation made sense on the surface, but something about her tone didn't sit right with me. It lacked the warmth she usually had when she talked about small gestures like that. Instead, it felt mechanical, like she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear. Then came the flowers. One afternoon, I came home to find a massive bouquet of roses sitting in the middle of our dining table. I hadn't bought them, but when I asked, she claimed she had bought them for herself. "You haven't gotten me flowers in a while," she said with a teasing smile. I figured I'd treat myself. At first, I let it go. But the next week, another bouquet appeared. This time, they were lilies, her favorite. Again, she claimed to have bought them herself, but the story felt weaker, more forced. Emily had never been the type to splurge on flowers for no reason. Something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to dig deeper. I knew I had to be careful. I didn't want to make a move until I had solid proof. So, I started by checking her phone when she wasn't around. I knew it was an invasion of privacy, but I was desperate to understand what was going on. Her phone was locked, but I knew her passcode, our anniversary. I scrolled through her messages, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain her behavior. At first, there was nothing. No suspicious texts, no calls from unknown numbers. Just the usual messages between her and her friends. But as I dug deeper, I found something odd. There were long gaps in her message history, entire conversations that seemed to have been deleted. It was subtle, but it was there. She was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what. The more I watched, the more I noticed patterns. She'd leave the house for errands that took longer than they should have. She claimed to be meeting friends, but she always seemed to come home with the same story: "We just grabbed coffee," or "It was a quick lunch." I checked the security cameras at our house, and sure enough, she wasn't going where she said she was. Her car wasn't parked near the places she claimed to visit, and sometimes, she was gone for hours without a clear explanation. Then came the day that changed everything. I had a late meeting at the office, and as I was leaving, I saw Emily's car parked across the street. My heart raced as I realized she was there again without telling me. I decided to confront her, but not before I had my evidence. I rushed back to my desk and checked the building's security cameras. What I saw confirmed everything I had feared. There, on the footage, was Emily, walking into the office with Dan. They didn't know I was still in the building. They thought the place was empty. I watched as they walked into my office, laughing, acting like it was theirs. My blood boiled as I realized what was happening. All the pieces fell into place: the late-night visits, the flowers, the secretive phone calls. It wasn't just my imagination. Emily and Dan were having an affair, right under my nose, in the very office I had built from the ground up. I sat there, staring at the screen, my world crumbling around me. The betrayal hit like a freight train, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know what to do. Confronting them wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about my business, my marriage, my entire life being turned upside down. I had the proof I needed, but I wasn't ready to act, at least not yet. If they thought they could get away with this, they were wrong. The moment I saw them together on the office security footage, my entire world collapsed. I couldn't believe it, even though I had spent weeks gathering clues, piecing together the moments that had led me here. Seeing Emily and Dan in my office laughing, comfortable with each other, was a gut punch. They didn't even care that they were in my space, the place I had built with sweat and sleepless nights. The office that stood as a symbol of my hard work was now tainted by their betrayal. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the screen, replaying the footage over and over. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or had they been sneaking around for months? The thoughts twisted in my mind, and I felt physically ill. I wanted to march into the office and confront them, scream at them for destroying everything I thought we had. But I didn't. I knew I needed more than just an outburst. I needed a plan. I left the office without them knowing I had been there, careful not to alert them. My mind raced as I drove home, the city lights blurring past me. I had to be calm, methodical. If I exploded, if I let my emotions control me, they would just deny it, twist the story, and make me out to be the bad guy. No, I needed undeniable proof, something that neither of them could refute. At home, Emily greeted me like everything was normal. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day was. It took everything in me to play along, to not let on that I knew what she had been up to just hours earlier. I forced myself to act casual, nodding and responding with the usual pleasantries, all the while feeling like I was drowning in my own rage. The next day, I made my move. I installed another camera in my office, this one inside, hidden in the ceiling vent. It would capture everything, every conversation, every gesture. I wasn't going to let them continue this without consequences. The camera would give me the proof I needed to expose them both, in a way that neither of them could deny. And I didn't have to wait long. Just a few days later, while I was out of town for a meeting, I checked the camera feed from my phone. Sure enough, there they were, Emily and Dan, sitting in my office, their closeness unmistakable. They weren't just talking. They were acting like they owned the place, like they had every right to be there, together. Emily looked at Dan in a way I hadn't seen her look at me in years, her eyes filled with an intimacy that was once reserved for us. It was unbearable. And then, the moment I had dreaded but expected. It was brief, almost casual, as if this was something they did often, something that had become routine. I watched in horror. They were both married. We had all known each other for years. How could they do this to me? To Dan's wife? To our entire lives? I had my proof. There was no escaping it now. I downloaded the footage and saved it on multiple devices, making sure I had backups in case things escalated. This was no longer just suspicion, it was undeniable betrayal, captured in high definition. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't face Emily, not without tearing her apart verbally, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. I needed to process everything, to figure out my next move. I checked into a hotel, telling her I had an extended business trip, and spent hours thinking through every possible scenario. Divorce was the obvious choice, but it felt too simple, too easy. Emily and Dan had taken something from me: my trust, my marriage, and my business partnership, and I wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. The next morning, I made a decision. If they wanted to destroy what we had built, I would make sure they paid for it in ways they couldn't even imagine. Revenge wasn't just an option, it was necessary. I started with Dan. Our business partnership was on shaky ground already, but now it was irreparable. I called in favors, started moving assets quietly, preparing for the fallout. I knew I had the upper hand financially, and I wasn't going to let Dan walk away with a dime more than he deserved. Every deal we had signed, every contract, would now be scrutinized. I wanted him out of the business completely, but I also wanted him to feel the sting of losing everything he had worked for. While I dismantled our business relationship behind the scenes, I also set my sights on a more personal form of revenge. Dan's wife, Sarah, had always been friendly with me, and I knew she had no idea what was going on between Dan and Emily. I invited her out for drinks under the guise of discussing a potential business deal. It was all part of my plan, and she fell for it easily. It wasn't just about revenge, though that was part of it. It was about reclaiming control over a situation where I had felt powerless. Meeting with Sarah gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction, knowing that Dan would never expect it. I knew it wouldn't erase the pain of Emily's betrayal, but it gave me a fleeting moment of control, a brief victory in a battle that had already cost me so much. Finally, it was time to confront Emily. I returned home late that night, emotionally drained but resolved. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold and steady. She looked up, confused. "About what?" "I know about you and Dan." Her face went pale, and she stammered for a moment before trying to deny it. "What are you talking about?" "That's ridiculous." I pulled out my phone and showed her the footage, watching her expression shift from shock to panic. There was no escape, no way to talk her way out of this. "I've seen everything," I said, my voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "Every lie, every meeting, every kiss. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No pity, no empathy, just a cold, burning rage. She tried to apologize, to explain, but it was too late. I didn't want her excuses. I didn't want her at all. "We're done, Emily," I said, standing up. "You've made your choice and now you can live with it." With that, I left, slamming the door behind me. The marriage, the business, the life we had built, it was all gone. And while the betrayal still stung, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be the only one suffering the consequences. The night I confronted Emily, something inside me snapped. Her betrayal had cut me deeply, and while I had left her crying on the couch, I knew that wasn't enough. I wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let people destroy everything I had worked for without facing the consequences. No, I was going to make sure both Emily and Dan paid for what they'd done personally and professionally. The first step was dismantling Dan's life, and I knew exactly where to start. Our business, the company we had built together from scratch, was something he valued almost as much as I did. But unlike me, Dan's ambition had always been tied to shortcuts. He thrived on charm, not hard work, and that made him vulnerable. I had been the one to keep the company steady while Dan basked in the spotlight, and now I was going to use that to my advantage. I spent the next few days quietly shifting assets, moving money into separate accounts, and ensuring that my name was the one attached to all the major contracts and deals. Dan was none the wiser, too busy with his affair to notice what was happening under his nose. By the time he realized something was wrong, it would be too late. I would have full control of the business, and he'd be left with nothing. While I worked on the business side of things, my personal revenge plan was already in motion. Dan's wife, Sarah, had unknowingly become part of my strategy. After our first encounter, it didn't take much to keep her interested. She was lonely, neglected by Dan's constant absences, and more than willing to find comfort in me. Each time we met, I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that Dan's life was unraveling, just like mine had. Sleeping with Sarah wasn't just about revenge, though. It gave me a sense of power over the situation, something I had been missing ever since I discovered Emily's affair. With Sarah, I was in control. I wasn't the victim anymore, I was the one calling the shots. And the irony of it all wasn't lost on me. While Dan thought he was getting away with betraying me, I was already one step ahead, dismantling his life piece by piece. I didn't stop there. I knew Dan and Emily still had no idea I had seen the footage, and that was my greatest weapon. I started planting small seeds of doubt in both of their minds, subtle suggestions that would make them question each other. When Emily asked where I had been late at night, I'd smile and tell her I had been catching up with an old friend. The look on her face was priceless, confused, maybe even a little jealous, but she couldn't say anything. After all, she was the one who had been unfaithful. Meanwhile, with Dan, I played it cool. We still had to work together, at least for the time being, so I kept up the charade of normalcy. I dropped hints about my suspicions in casual conversation, watching as he grew more paranoid. I've been noticing a lot of strange things lately, I'd say with a smirk. People aren't always who they seem, you know? He'd laugh it off, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. He was starting to sweat, starting to wonder if I knew more than I was letting on. And that was exactly what I wanted. The final piece of my plan came when I set up a meeting with Sarah, Emily, and Dan without any of them knowing the others would be there. I arranged it under the guise of a business dinner, something casual, nothing suspicious. Sarah arrived first, looking as stunning as always, clearly expecting a quiet evening with me. Then came Emily, her face falling the moment she saw Sarah sitting there. And finally, Dan walked in, his expression turning from confusion to pure dread as he realized what was happening. I sat back, enjoying the show. Sarah was the first to speak, clearly annoyed. What's going on here? Why are we all here together? Emily was silent, her eyes darting between me and Dan, who looked like he might pass out at any second. I leaned forward, smiling calmly. I thought it was time we all had a little chat. You see, I've known about you two for a while now. I gestured toward Emily and Dan, watching as their faces turned white with shock. Sarah, clearly confused, looked at Dan. What is he talking about? Dan stammered, unable to find the words. Emily, too, remained silent, her face a mask of guilt. I've seen the footage, I said, my voice cold. Every lie, every meeting, every time you two thought you were being so clever. You weren't. Sarah's expression turned from confusion to fury as she realized what I was implying. You've been cheating on me? She snapped, her voice trembling with anger. Dan tried to deny it, but it was no use. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. I stood up, ready to leave them to tear each other apart. I hope it was worth it, I said, turning to walk away. Because by the time I'm done, none of you will have anything left. As I left the restaurant, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction wash over me. The revenge plan was complete. Emily and Dan's lives were crumbling, just like mine had, but this time, I was in control. The restaurant confrontation marked the beginning of the end for Emily, Dan, and everything we had once shared. As I walked out that night, leaving them in shock and Sarah fuming with betrayal, I knew that what came next would be chaos. I had set the stage for their downfall, and all I had to do now was watch it unfold. It didn't take long for the consequences of their actions to catch up with them. The next day, Emily tried to reach me, calling and texting nonstop. I ignored every attempt. Her messages started with apologies, then shifted to pleading, and eventually turned into angry outbursts. She went from trying to explain her side to blaming me for everything, typical Emily. But I didn't care. She had made her choice, and now she was facing the consequences. At home, the tension was unbearable. Emily stayed in the guest room, and we barely spoke. I could see the guilt and desperation in her eyes, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. I had already heard enough lies. The silence between us was thick, every moment a reminder of the betrayal that had torn our marriage apart. She'd occasionally try to start a conversation, but I always shut her down with a cold stare or a brief response. Dan, on the other hand, was in complete panic mode. He called me the morning after the confrontation, trying to pretend like nothing had happened. He was desperate to keep the business running smoothly, as if the personal disaster wouldn't bleed into our professional lives. But I had already set the wheels in motion. I knew that the fallout wasn't just going to be emotional, it was going to be financial too. Behind the scenes, I had continued to move assets and secure my control over the company. I met with our legal team, ensuring that I had the upper hand in every way possible. By the time Dan realized what was happening, I had already made sure his influence in the company was limited. Our business was falling apart, but I wasn't going to let him walk away with more than he deserved. I had planned to keep things civil, to quietly phase him out of the company, but Dan wasn't having it. He tried to fight back, demanding explanations and accusing me of betraying him. The audacity of it made me laugh. After everything he had done sneaking around with my wife, violating our friendship, our partnership, he actually thought he could play the victim. The legal battle that followed was as ugly as it was predictable. Dan tried to claim that the company wouldn't exist without him, that he was the driving force behind its success. I knew better. I had built that company brick by brick, and Dan had been more of a weight than a help. He may have been charismatic and good with clients, but I was the one who kept the ship afloat. And now, I was making sure he sank with it. The lawsuits and business meetings dragged on for weeks, and in the end, Dan had no choice but to sell his shares and leave. He walked away with a fraction of what he thought he was worth, and it was a sweet moment watching him sign the papers, knowing he had lost everything. His reputation in the business world took a nosedive, and people began to see him for what he truly was, a man who got by on charm and deceit, not skill. As for Emily, things were no better. The fallout from the affair hit her hard. The life she had enjoyed, the luxury, the stability, it was all slipping away. Friends who once admired her began to distance themselves, and the social circles she had thrived in became cold and unforgiving. She was no longer the well-put-together wife of a successful businessman. She was the woman who had destroyed her own marriage and was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered reputation. Sarah, Dan's wife, didn't waste any time either. She filed for divorce almost immediately after the confrontation. It was clear that whatever life Dan thought he had, it was gone. I didn't stay in touch with Sarah after that night, but I heard through the grapevine that she had gotten everything she wanted in the divorce settlement. Dan walked away with barely a dime to his name. While all of this unfolded, I tried to keep my focus on the future. The business had been saved, but just barely. My personal life, on the other hand, was in shambles. I started divorce proceedings against Emily, determined to cut all ties and move on. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about freeing myself from the weight of a broken marriage, from a relationship that had clearly died long before I found out about her betrayal. Emily fought the divorce at first, trying to convince me that we could work things out. She cried, she begged, she promised that it was just a mistake. But I had heard enough. I wasn't interested in reconciliation, and I wasn't interested in her excuses. The betrayal was too deep, too personal. The Emily I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. The divorce was finalized a few months later. I kept the house, the assets, the business, everything. Emily left with what little she had left, and I didn't look back. As I signed the final papers, I felt a sense of closure, but also a strange emptiness. The life I had built, the life I thought was perfect, had been an illusion. But at least now, I was free to rebuild on my own terms. In the end, Dan and Emily got what they deserved. Their actions had destroyed not just our marriages, but their own lives as well. The fallout was brutal, but it was just. And as for me, I wasn't the same man I had been before, but I knew that moving forward, I would be stronger, smarter, and far less trusting. Once the dust settled from the divorce and the legal battles, I found myself standing in the wreckage of what used to be my life. The marriage, the business partnership, the friendships, it was all gone. For a while, I wasn't sure how to move forward. It felt like I was starting from scratch, rebuilding not just my life, but my sense of self. But then, something unexpected happened. I realized that the emptiness I felt wasn't as crushing as I thought it would be. In fact, it began to feel like a blank canvas, a fresh start. The weight of Emily's betrayal and the business collapse had lifted, and in its place, I found a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied down by anyone's expectations or deceit. I started focusing on myself again, working out, traveling, even picking up old hobbies I had neglected for years. The business, now solely mine, began to thrive under my sole direction, free from Dan's influence. It wasn't long before I was attracting new clients and expanding in ways I hadn't imagined before. My life was back on track, but this time it was on my terms. And then came the twist. Her name was Natalie. I met her at a charity gala a few months after the divorce, And she was everything Emily wasn't: genuine, kind, and refreshingly honest. She didn't care about my money or my status. She was fiercely independent, confident, and beautiful in a way that didn't scream for attention. We clicked immediately, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt a real connection. Being with Natalie was a stark contrast to the life I had lived with Emily. There were no secrets, no hidden agendas, just two people enjoying each other's company. As we spent more time together, I realized I wasn't just moving on, I was moving towards something better. Natalie brought out the best in me, and being with her made me realize how much I had settled for mediocrity in the past. But here's the twist. I never told her about my revenge on Dan or the affair with his wife. It was my secret, a chapter one had closed. I didn't need to relive that bitterness with her. Natalie was my clean slate, and with her, I didn't need revenge or vindication. I had already won by simply moving on, and I was content to leave that dark part of my life behind. In the end, I didn't just survive the betrayal, I thrived. Dan and Emily had been a destructive force in my life, but they didn't define me. I rebuilt everything they tried to take from me, and now, with Natalie by my side, I was living a life that was far more fulfilling than the one I had before. It wasn't about getting even anymore. It was about moving forward, stronger and smarter than I had ever been.